Before we get into the lecture, I want to remind you of a couple of things. This, of course, is your last chapter, and I apologize for not being able to get further along in your Western Civilization book. This is a short week. You are basically going to be almost 2 days short, but you still have the same amount of work to cover. This particular chapter is one of the shorter ones. We don't go into an awful lot of details like I wish we could have time to do, but no. And you'll also notice there is something called a critical thinking quiz. That's the one I was telling you about earlier that the school has mandated that the Western Civ students must take. It's not mandatory. However, it is worth 35 points on your final score, so I would suggest that you give it a go. It's supposed to be over material that we have covered during this semester. I have not looked at the questions. I really don't know what it's about. I had nothing to do with it whatsoever. It just popped up in my grade book, and when I questioned on it, that's when I was told what was going on. I hope that you all were better informed than I was. That being said, Chapter 27, the Cold War, Global Politics, the Economic Recovery, and Cultural Changes in European Countries. Europe, of course, was a wasteland of wreckage and confusion, with millions and millions of refugees trying to return home, where housing and food and fuel were not only scarce, they were non-existent in a lot of places. And the brutality of war and occupation had divided countries, and peoples in the countries had different opinions. Liberation went hand in hand with recrimination, especially over something called collaboration with the Nazis. Restoring government authority, functioning bureaucracies, and a legal system was, of course, a priority, and learning how to steer a course between justice and forgetting. But the dramatic changes in international balance of power are going to really emerge, and you're going to have two superpowers and something called the Cold War. And it's, of course, going to be the collapse of the European empires and the old colonial system, and the creation of new nations, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. Now, the Cold War in a divided continent kind of says it all. In Tehran and Malta, before the war ended, of course, there had been conferences between the Big Four. And the Soviets, who were doing most of the fighting on the Eastern Front, argued that they had a legitimate claim to all of Eastern Europe. Well, Stalin, Churchill, and, and of course it included FDR at the time, and the Percentages Agreement in 1944. They were going to divide Europe into spheres of influence. Now, in all honesty, and regardless of what you think about communism, Stalin had a legitimate claim. He was doing the fighting. He was liberating those countries from the Nazis, and his country had been overrun so many times from the West. He wanted a sphere of influence to give him a little free time to think and get ready for another war. But for the Soviets, Eastern Europe was supposed to be a shield and a spear. So they created something called the Eastern Bloc. And of course, the People's Republic of China were very sympathetic to Moscow. Meanwhile, when Churchill was no longer Prime Minister of England, he was visiting the United States, and in a little college in Virginia, he made the speech that Europe had been divided by an iron curtain from the Adriatic to the Balkans. And there was no real curtain. It was just a figure of speech that the Soviet influence on one side and the Western influence on the other side. The Czech coalition government, well, it tried to go democratic, and of course the Soviets crushed it. And Europe and the United States did nothing. And by 1948, the end of it, Soviet had dependencies in Poland and Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria. They had gotten what they wanted, communist countries surrounding Russia itself. Yugoslavia, Tito was a little bit harder to deal with. He declared his government independent of Moscow and also really the United States. He was drawing support from the Serbs and the Croats and the Muslims in Yugoslavia itself, and you've got a Duke's mixture there. And of course, he was immediately expelled from any Communist Party's economic and military pacts. Then the Soviet purges began in the parties and the administration of all the satellite governments. It was made easier because even during the war, any signs of democracy had been shattered, and there was a renewal of anti-Semitism once the war is over. In Greece, according to your text, local communist-led resistance was on the verge of seizing power. Now, prior to the war, Britain had been bolstering up Greece and Turkey financially to help economic status. But after the war, they did not have the finances to do it, so they requested the United States help. We found out later it really wasn't a communist-led resistance. It was basically an internal civil war. But we were determined to keep Greece and Turkey in their sphere of Western influence. So Greece kind of became a touchstone for escalating the American fear of communist expansion. Territorial changes in Europe, it seemed like every time you turn around, didn't used to anything change. But nowadays, when you have wars, the whole landscape changes. Of course, we have two Germanys. The Western powers decided to divide up the country of Germany into four spheres. But it ended up being two hostile areas intended to be temporary. So the entire country of Germany was divided into four: Russian zone, British zone, American zone, and Russian zone, as well as Berlin, the capital, which was located well inside the Russian zone. Now, the three Western allies of France, Germany, and the United States didn't take long to kind of try to put things back together and give them support and come up with a single Western Germany. Well, the Soviets didn't like this. They were at the time stripping anything they could out of East Germany to take back to Russia to help with their industrialization, which they had never gotten done before the war. So they immediately, when the Western side decided to issue a new currency and think about turning control back over to the West Germans, Berlin on the eastern side got a little testy. They cut off all methods to get to West Germany to supply food and supplies. They cut off the power. That's where the Berlin airlift was started. And I have a small little film over here that pretty much spells it out for you. It seems a little bit sophomoric, but it explains it pretty well. So you have the Federal Republic of West Germany under France, England, and the United States control, and the Eastern German Democratic Republic of East Germany. This is pretty much how it was decided. As you can see, not only is Germany divided, but Frankfurt is divided. And I think it is only 3 or 4 minutes long. It's not very long, but it spells it out very well. You're going to miss these pauses before YouTube when this course is over with. You're going to say, I used to be able to sit there and have a Coke or a sandwich while I was waiting.
One of the first major incidents during the Cold War became known as the Berlin Airlift. What was the Berlin Airlift, and why was it carried out? At the conclusion of World War II, Germany was divided into 4 portions. The United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union each controlled one segment. The city of Berlin, which was located in the Soviet sector, was also split into 4 similar segments. The Americans, British, and French portions joined together to create West Berlin, while the Soviet region was known as East Berlin. In 1948, the American, British, and French regions of Germany announced that they would be creating and using a new currency called the Deutschmark. This would replace the old German currency known as the Reichsmark. In response to this decision, the Soviet Union halted all traffic between East Berlin and West Berlin. They also severed all communications with the non-Soviet sectors of the city. Supply trains were turned around and even the electricity was cut from West Berlin. Since Berlin was located 100 miles inside the Soviet sector of Germany, this meant that the non-Soviet region of Berlin was completely isolated and in a hostile territory. At the time, this region of Berlin had enough food to last about 36 days and only 45 days worth of coal. By June 24, 1948, West Berlin was completely cut off from the rest of the world and surrounded by 2.5 million Soviet troops. On June 25th, the U.S., Great Britain, and other Allied nations decided on a response. It became known as the Berlin Airlift. The Allies began flying planes into West Berlin, each one carrying loads of supplies, including food, coal, and other necessities. At first, progress was slow, but before long, fresh supplies were flowing into West Berlin by the minute. The Soviets were helpless to stop these flights. If they had opened fire on the aircraft, it would have been considered an act of war. So the planes were allowed to land, supplying West Berliners with the essential items and food that they needed. By April of 1949, the Soviets realized that their blockade effort was futile. And finally, on May the 12th, 1949, the Soviet blockade of Berlin came to an end. Even after the blockade was lifted, the Berlin Airlift continued for several months, lasting a total of 15. With countless planes landing in Berlin. At the airlift's conclusion, the American and British Air Forces had combined to supply the city with over 2 million tons of supplies. There were 101 deaths caused by crashes during the airlift, and these deaths became the first casualties of the Cold War. The cost of the airlift was $224 million. However, most believe it was a small price to pay to secure the lives and freedom of those in West Berlin.
Oh dear. Okay, this is what I want right there. Every now and then I really do it wrong. One of the things that happened during this airlift right before it ended, now we have no way of knowing for sure, but we have heard rumors, if you would, and if you could see me, you'd see me with my fingers up as quotation mark, rumors. There was a squadron of bombers, American bombers, that were landed in Britain just a few days before this Berlin airlift ended. And they were the same type of bomber that had dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. The rumor was that Truman, our president at the time, or the president of the United States at the time, was a little bit perturbed and he was going to use nuclear weapons. There wasn't any more nuclear weapons to use, number one, and I don't think the president would ever have authorized that, but it makes a good little story, doesn't it? So in response to the Soviet expansion was, well, you can't just give people fish to eat, as the saying goes. You must teach them how to fish, and this is what the Marshall Plan was designed to do, to teach them how to plow better, to teach them how to plant better, to teach them how to make their machines work. Don't just give them food and money, give them help and teach them how to do things, to take care of themselves. It was a wonderful plan, named after the Secretary of State, George Marshall, who incidentally was also the General Marshal during World War II. And then President Truman issued something called the Truman Doctrine in 1947. He said that the United States would issue military assistance to any anti-communist in the country of Greece. You're going to support the free people's resistance to communism. And of course, this was tied to political power for economics, of course. The Marshall Plan, $13 billion in aid for industrial development over a period of 4 years. But of course, the USSR refused to accept any aid and refused to let any of her satellite countries accept any of the aid. It encouraged their states to diagnose their own problems and develop solutions on their own. But the military aid Marshall Plan, it was going to require deep control of prices, restraints on the wages, and a balanced budget. You can't just throw money at a problem. You've got to find a personal or good use for it. And I think it was one of the best plans that the United States had ever come up with. Well, the other countries in Europe are starting to get a little worried. Is Stalin going to become another Hitler? So they wanted to know, would the United States come to their aid again? So hand in hand, the United States, Canada, and some of the Western European states got together and came up with something called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. General Eisenhower, the commander of the Allied forces in Europe, became the senior military commander. And the situation was that any one of them got attacked by an armed attack, or had an armed attack rather, NATO would come to their aid. Well, the Soviet response to the Marshall Plan, they just kept seeing the Western democracies getting more and more involved in Europe, and it was a threat. So they formed their own little assistance council for mutual economic assistance, and the Communist Information Bureau was formed in late 40s and 47. And they didn't get around to forming something to be the same as NATO, their Warsaw Pact, but it was 1955 where that happened, and they had all their little satellite nations involved. So that it's kind of like you've got a nice toy, I'm gonna get a nice toy too. Well, we weren't the only one to have the atomic bomb, and unbeknownst to us at the time, Soviets knew about the atomic bomb before the President of the United States did. They had their own bomb tested in 49. It wasn't too long after that China did too. We lost China. The Soviets and the United States both had the hydrogen bomb in 1953, of which everyone, including myself, was thoroughly convinced that if they ever set it off, it was going to cause a chain reaction and destroy the Earth. The intercontinental ballistic missiles and delivery systems, atomic-powered submarines. The new president of the United States, General Eisenhower, even no longer general, of course, he had left NATO and become Republican and ran for president and won. We always like to record in the United States our war heroes with the presidency. He decided he was going to nuclearize our arsenal. Of course, that kind of polarized the Cold War because it forced each one of the countries, the giant nations, of which there were only two now, the Soviet Union and the United States, to kind of, be cautious with your finger on the trigger. But everybody was afraid that some little small thing like what started World War I might work into a general World War III. But the hydrogen bomb and nuclearization became symbols of the new age, science, technology, and progress. And of course, and I should have put this in red, the threat of mass destruction. There's different views, civil defense and height. Stalin had, as the leader of his country, he did have some real concerns, and he also believed thoroughly in communism, and his fear of the West and the United States' fear of communism fueled the Cold War. The United States was unwilling to give up her military, economic, and political power. It's the first time the United States had ever been top dog in the world. And of course, the Soviet Union did not trust the West. The West did not trust the East. But so there was a new balance of power, I guess you could say, where they used to worry about whether France has got more weapons than Spain and vice versa. Now we're worried about the United States and Russia. George Kennan, who was the Undersecretary of State under Marshall, came up with a policy of containment. And of course, that's to draw a line in the sand and say communism can't go any further. And it intensified every day, and the anxiety for the people, not only in Europe, but in the United States. Now, this little film, it is strictly a Western film. However, it shows you the way things were handled for giving out information. And yes, it's a 1940s film, but it's very real. Actually, I think it was a little bit later. It's probably 51, 52, somewhere along in there when it was actually filmed. But if it was that way in the United States, you know it was similar in the other countries. So bear with it. Do not laugh too much. This is what was shown to school children in the United States. Because, you know, it starts with the children. You have to educate them.
Dum dum, diddle dum dum, diddle dum dum, diddle dum dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered. He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just happens because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. This is an official civil defense film produced in cooperation with the Federal Civil Defense Administration and in consultation with the Safety Commission of the National Education Association. Produced by Archer Productions, Incorporated. Hey, Bert, come on out and meet all these nice people. Please? Oh, all right. We really can't blame you. You see, Bert is a very, very careful fellow. When there's danger, this is the way he keeps from being hurt. Sometimes it even saves his life. That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it, just as we are ready for many other dangers that are around us all the time. Fire is a danger. It can burn whole buildings if someone is careless. But we are ready for fires. We have a fine fire department to put out the fire, and you have fire drills in your school so you know what to do. Automobiles can be dangerous too. They sometimes cause bad accidents, but we are ready. We have safety rules that car drivers and people who are walking must obey. Now, we must be ready for a new danger, the atomic bomb. First, you'll have to know what happens when an atomic bomb explodes. You will know when it comes. We hope it never comes, but we must get ready. It looks something like this. There is a bright flash, brighter than the sun, brighter than anything you've ever seen. If you are not ready and did not know what to do, it could hurt you in different ways. It could knock you down hard or throw you against a tree or a wall. It is such a big explosion, it can smash in buildings and knock signboards over and break windows all over town. But if you duck and cover like Bert, you will be much safer. You know how bad sunburn can feel. The atomic bomb flash could burn you worse than a terrible sunburn, especially where you're not covered. Now, you and I don't have shells to crawl into like Bert the turtle, so we have to cover up in our own way. First, you duck, and then you cover. And very tightly, you cover the back of your neck and your face. Duck and cover underneath a table or desk or anything else close by. In Betty's school, they are talking about the atomic bomb, too. Betty is asking her teacher, how can we tell when the atomic bomb may explode? And her teacher is explaining that there are two kinds of attack, with warning and without any warning. We think that most of the time we will be warned before the bomb explodes, so there will be time for us to get into our homes, schools, or some other safe place. Our civil defense workers and our men in uniform will do everything they can to warn us before enemy planes can bring a bomb near us. You may be in your schoolyard playing when the signal comes. That signal means to stop whatever you are doing and get to the nearest safe place fast. Always remember, the flash of an atomic bomb can come at any time, no matter where you may be. You might be out playing at home when the warning comes. Then be sure to get into the house fast, where your parents have fixed a safe place for you to go. If you are not close to home when you hear the warning, go to the nearest safe cover. Know where you are to go, or ask an older person to help you. You know the places marked with the S sign? They're safe places to go when you hear the alarm. If there is a warning, you will hear it before the bomb explodes. But sometimes, and this is very, very important, sometimes the bomb might explode without any warning. Then the first thing we would know about it would be the flash. And that means duck and cover fast, wherever you are. There's no time to look around or wait. Be like Bert. When there is a flash, duck and cover, and do it fast. Here are some older boys showing what to do if the flash comes when you are not in the classroom. This is what to do if you should be in a corridor. You duck and cover tight against the wall this way. Remember to keep your face and the back of your neck covered tightly. Try to fall away from windows or doors with glass in them. Then, if the glass breaks and flies through the air, it won't cut you. You might be eating your lunch when the flash comes. Duck and cover under the table. Then, If the explosion makes anything in the room fall down, it can't fall on you. Getting ready means we will all have to be able to take care of ourselves. The bomb might explode when there are no grown-ups near. Paul and Patty know this, and they're always ready to take care of themselves. Here they are on their way to school on a beautiful spring day. But no matter where they go or what they do, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Paul and Patty know what to do. Paul covered the back of his head so that he wouldn't be burned, and Patty covered herself with the coat she was carrying. They knew how to duck and cover. They acted right away when the flash came. If they had been at this doorway when the bomb flashed, Paul and Patty would have ducked and covered this way, like this girl. Heavy doorways are a good place to duck and cover. She will be safer, too. Here's Tony going to his Cub Scout meeting. Tony knows the bomb can explode any time of the year, day or night. He is ready for it. Duck and cover. Attaboy, Tony. That flash means act fast. Tony knows that it helps to get to any kind of cover. This wall was close by, so that's where he ducked and covered. Tony knew what to do. Notice how he keeps from moving or from getting up and running? He stays down until he is sure the danger is over. The man helping Tony is a civil defense worker. His job is to help protect us when there is danger of the atomic bomb. We must obey the civil defense worker. We must know how to duck and cover in the school bus or in any other bus or streetcar. Duck and cover. Don't wait. Duck away from the windows fast. The glass may break and fly through the air and cut you. Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. This family knows what to do, just as your own family should. They know that even a thin cloth helps protect them. Even a newspaper can save you from a bad burn. But the most important thing of all is to duck and cover yourself, especially where your clothes do not cover you. No matter where we live, in the city or the country, we must be ready all the time for the atomic bomb. Duck and cover. That's the first thing to do, duck and cover. The next important thing to do after that is to stay covered until the danger is over. Yes, we must all get ready now so we know how to save ourselves if the atomic bomb ever explodes near us. If you do not know just what to do, ask your teacher when this film is over. Discuss what you could do in different places if a bomb explodes. Older people will help us as they always do, but there might not be any grown-ups around when the bomb explodes. Then, you're on your own.
Remember what to do, friends. Now tell me right out loud. What are you supposed to do when you see the flash?
Duck and cover. Duck and cover. Duck and cover.
I think a moment of silence is probably necessary. You understand now why there was so much paranoia among the people of my generation and even older, and it wasn't just in the United States. Everybody was sure either the Soviet Union was going to bomb the US of A or the US of A was going to bomb the Soviet Union. Paranoia is all I can say. But in a way, it's so simplistic. I noticed at the beginning of the film it said 1951. See, we still do not understand all the ramifications at that time of nuclear exposure and radiation poisoning. So, in my opinion was, ladies and gentlemen, if you're somewhere and you see a loud flash or don't hear a loud flash, you see a loud flash, and you're going to duck and cover, while you're doing that, you might as well bend over and kiss your butt goodbye, because you're not going to survive. And if you are living close to a place where the bomb is going to be dropped, I don't think I want to live to see what's going to happen afterwards. But this was the way it was in the 50s. The United States was afraid of communism. The Soviet Union was afraid of capitalism. Well, Stalin doesn't live forever, of course. He dies. And when he dies, a little short, fat man that looks like a grandpa named Nikita Khrushchev took over. And he agreed to meet with Britain and France and the United States, and in a secret speech he was denouncing Stalinization. It was too extreme. We're going to have a thaw. And everyone was very happy with it. Oh, great, maybe this is going to end. Well, then there was starting to be people in Russia doing things. I don't know if I can say his name properly or not. I've read his books. Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He wrote One Day in the Life of Ivan Deminsky, who was in the Gulag, the first circle, the Gulag archipelago. Of course, he was arrested and exiled because he was talking about the government. But he also didn't just criticize Soviet Union. He criticized the American commercialization as well as the Soviet expansion and repression. But the thaw did not necessarily mean the USSR was going to lessen control over her satellite states. East German government faced very strong economic crisis because, as I said, they'd been stripping it steadily of the people who knew what to do and machines to go back to Russia. 58,000 East Germans left for the West. There were strikes and unrest. Of course, they were put down immediately by the Soviet army. The leader of the Western Berlin, Walter Ulrich, used fears of disorder to solidify the one-party rule. And, of course, if that didn't work with just fears, we used something a little stronger. Poland's demanding more independence, wanted to manage your own country's affairs. And, of course, the response was met with Soviet troops. Władysław Gomulka, I guess is how you say it, pledged Poland's loyalty to the Warsaw Pact. Good, solid, staunch communist. In Hungary, Emir Nagy was a nationalist and a communist, and there was a much broader anti-communist struggle there, and they tried to leave the Warsaw Pact. Of course, Soviet troops entered Budapest in November of 1956, and, well, the Soviets installed Johann Kotter as a very staunch communist leader, and we have a new president in the United States at this time by the name of Eisenhower. He did nothing. The West did nothing. The Soviets are continually crushing any attempt at democracy, and nobody's doing anything. Khrushchev and peaceful coexistence? Well, NATO placed battlefield nuclear weapons in West Germany. Meanwhile, East Germans are continuing to flee, and it says 2.7 million between 49 and 61 left the East to go to the West. So Khrushchev demands a permanent division of Germany with a free city of Berlin. Of course, the United States and all the Western leaders said no, so his response was to build the Berlin Wall. This is another little short one about the effects in the building of it.
In the embers of World War II, a defeated Germany was carved up, occupied by Britain, France, and the United States to the west, and the Soviet Union to the east. Berlin, which lay well within the Eastern Territory, was also divided, the West an island of capitalism engulfed by a communist superbloc. Though many Berliners could still move freely within the city, well, that was until August 13th, 1961. Berliners awoke to a barbed wire fence surrounding the western part of the city, a barrier to contain East Germans hungry for the lifestyles of the West. Overnight, families were split, and East Berliners working in the West were cut off from their jobs. Barbed wire soon became a sprawling concrete colossus, stretching 155 kilometers. Thousands of armed guards kept watch from 302 observation towers. Now, looking out from the east, past the outer wall, is an area known as the death zone, where guards will shoot to kill. A signal fence here sends a silent alarm when touched. Next, tank traps before a terrible carpet of metal spikes, nicknamed Stalin's Lawn. Then, the wall as the West saw it, 3.6 meters tall, topped with a half pipe in places to make it, scaling it almost impossible. More than 100,000 East Germans attempted to escape past the wall. At least 5,000 succeeded, but more than 200 died trying.
Ich bin ein Berliner.
One of President Kennedy's most rousing speeches was delivered here at the wall, within earshot of the East, a message repeated years later by President Reagan.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In 1989, cracks began to show. Guards were told not to shoot. Thousands rallied for freedom in East Berlin. On the 9th of November, a sea change. East Germans would be allowed to cross the border. Thousands headed to the wall. Tearful, jubilant Germans from both sides began to hack and rip down the concrete. Excited, welcoming hands reached over. East Berliners soaked up the strange Western wonderland, sparkling with the things they had so long been denied. In less than a year, the wall was in tatters and the Iron Curtain was being pulled back. Germany, fractured for 4 decades, was united once more. Atika Schubert, CNN.
My son was in Germany at the time this wall fell. And I've often wondered what it was like to be there. And he said, I was so excited because at the time it fell in 61, you've got to realize the civil rights movement was really running rampant in the United States. And those in the South, and that's where I was living at the time, we didn't really hear too much about it. Papers were always covering the civil rights movement instead of what was going on in Germany. So I'm ashamed to say I didn't learn a lot about it until I went back to school. But the wall itself and the people who had been denied so many things for so long and had heard about this glorious milk and honey part over there in West Berlin, when they escaped, they wanted immediately everything that the West Berliners had, and West Berlin nearly went bankrupt trying to meet their demands. And there was even some problems and riots and demonstrations because they didn't get what they wanted immediately. So it was good and bad at the same time. But the economic miracle in Western Europe, it was a miracle thanks to the people being eager to move forward and the Marshall Plan. But because of the war, and it happens every time there's a war, there's new technologies and have immediate applications like improved communications. All of a sudden we can manufacture synthetic aluminum, alloy materials, and rubber, and there are advances in techniques of prefabrication. But the Marshall Plan and high consumer demand and high levels of employment were just marvelous. So how did the government take hold of all of this? Well, Keyes is a very famous economist who people listen to. He thought that the government should plan the economy and be very dominant. And because of the war, when the government took over control of the government, most states had a managed economy during the war, and it lasted even after the war. In West Germany, provided tax breaks to encourage business investment from other countries, and Britain and Italy offered investment allowances. But there were mixed economies that combined both public and private ownership. For instance, in France, the electricity, gas, banking, radio, television, and auto industry were all state-managed. In Britain, coal, utilities, road and rail transport, and banking were nationalized and controlled by the government. But the government eventually contributed to the annual gross national product growth from 45 to 63. West Germany rose 7.6%, Austria 5.8%, Italy 6%, and the Netherlands 4.6%. So this is good when it starts going up and doesn't stagnate. But West Germany was particularly spectacular. Production increased 6-fold. Unemployment was less than half of 1%. And German demand for labor attracted foreign workers from all over Europe. So by the late 1950s, German goods were at the top of the world markets, and you started seeing things. We wanted German radios and German cars, the Volkswagen, etc. In France, the government played a direct role in the industrial reform, but giving priority to the basic industries. In Italy, capital from the government and Marshall Plan helped the northern part of Italy, but poverty remained pretty high in the agrarian south. The sad thing is, in Britain, the economy remained sluggish because obsolete factories and methods and the unwillingness of the bulldog stubbornness of the British people to adopt new techniques. European coal and steel community was a key to relations between West Germany and France. Now, all of a sudden, two countries that had been deadly enemies for so many decades are now going to be trading partners. They had power to regulate prices and production. And then they started something called the European Economic Community, or EEC, Common Market. They abolished the internal trade barriers, but had, common external tariffs. There was a free movement of labor and capital from one country to the other, a unified wage structure and social security systems. They were called the bureaucrats because it didn't matter where you were from, you could work anywhere and have the same pretty much pay that you had where you were. But Britain, who does not consider herself part of Europe, she's a separate island, she refused to join. So the EEC, the European Economic Community, becomes the world's largest exporter. And the total production is, as it says, more than 70% higher than it had been in 1950. Then there was something called the Bretton Woods Agreements. They were trying to coordinate movements of the global economy, and they created an International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But all currencies were pegged to the United States dollar, and soon began to play a rather major role in the development of what we call the Third World. Well, heavy industrial industries were the ones who were really the most impressive in being rebuilt. National incomes rose and output increased all over Europe. Poland and Hungary, even though communist-led, strengthened their economic conditions with the West, much to Stalin's disapproval. Oh, Stalin was gone by this time. Much to the Soviet Union's distress. 30% of the Eastern European trade was done outside the Soviet bloc. The Comecon compelled the other members to trade only with the Soviet Union, but pressures from Poland and Hungary began to force the Soviet Union to put some more focus on consumer goods. And one of the things we used to laugh about in the United States was a shortage of stuff in the Soviet Union, and the main shortage was toilet paper. Economic expansion promised more comprehensive social programs, too. The welfare state was a term coined by the British Labour Party, where they had free medical health care through the National Health Service. They had assistance to families and guaranteed secondary education. Welfare relief was an entitlement and not poor relief. Konrad Adenauer, the West German chancellor for some 15 years, he despised German militarism. He was very apprehensive about any German parliamentary government. He didn't like them either. He thought they were too militaristic. But it led to peaceful interaction with France. Like I said, two countries that had been at odds for decades were now going to become trading partners and basically friendly. General Charles de Gaulle, who didn't really like anybody in the West, and the Fifth French Republic, he returned to office during the Algerian conflict. But France pulls her forces from NATO in 1966, which we've gotten a little bit ahead of ourselves. It began to cultivate better relations with, guess who? Soviet Union. They've got modern military establishment. They're very technological advanced right now, and they have atomic weapons. So what about this third world? They're trying to avoid any entanglement or alignment with the USA or the USSR. And there was a Chinese Revolution. Mao Zedong adopted the Marxism to pleasant conditions in China. It's a little red book. He reduced rents. He provided health care and education. He reformed marriage. He started limiting one child per family to try to reduce the population. He wanted autonomy from the Western colonial powers. He wanted to turn China into an industrial power, and he did this at great human cost, but China now outproduces a lot of people. So the global impact of the Chinese Revolution and their, shall we say, they have the atomic bomb also now. But to the colonial powers in other areas like India and Africa, it represented the dangers of decolonization. And then something called the Korean War. It was really the first, what you call, hot spot after Berlin Wall in the Berlin airlift. North Korean troops attacked across the border in June of 1950, and everyone was sure it was Russia-inspired. However, we found out much later through, declassified documents that Stalin had said, don't do it. But the North Koreans wanted to do it anyway. So the United States goes to the United Nations and presented a proposal about the invasion and requests assistance. Well, Russia was boycotting the United Nations at that time, and so it was pushed through. It was never a declared war. It was what we call a police action. And General Douglas MacArthur was put in charge of the NATO forces, and it was primarily South Koreans and Americans. But Chinese troops supported North Korea, and they led counterattacks against this coalition on Thanksgiving Day a few months later, and there was a stalemate. Chinese and North Koreans against the United Nations, and the end of the Korean conflict came in 1953. So it only lasted 3 years, which is a lot less time than that series called MASH. 53 Americans and over 1 million Koreans and Chinese, and it was a bloody war, and there's still some people who were in there that are missing in action. If you get a chance to go onto YouTube and see some more films on the Korean police action, you're going to be surprised. It was not the good war that World War II was. But colonization of European empires are beginning to come apart between 47 and 60. Some of these people in India and Africa had started wanting to, get rid of their colonial masters before the war, but especially right after the end of World War I. But it came about in 3 ways. It's important to remember. In some regions, Europeans just simply cut their losses and went back home. In others, there was a nationalist movement that kind of successfully changed the government in their countries. And in the third one, violent struggles between the indigenous people and settlers. And of course, the settlers are the people who come in from the home country. The Indian National Congress begged Britain to get out after the war. Mohandas Gandhi, peaceful and loved protest. Jawaharlal Nehru was prime minister. He led the pro-independence Congress Party, and he was ethnic and religious conflict because they've got so many classes in India, number one. And of course, they have the one that's untouchable and the one that you can't. Anyway, the Muslim League wanted autonomy in the Muslim areas, and the Hindu people, they were afraid of because they were not as big as the Muslims. So British India was partitioned into India and Pakistan. Pakistan was Hindu, and the majority of India was Muslim. And between the two religious groups, there was brutal religious and ethnic warfare, and over 1 million people died. Gandhi was even assassinated by a Hindu zealot. Nehru became Prime Minister of India in 1947 and was through 1964. And through him, you had a program of industrialization and modernization. But he steered a course away from any type of entanglement with the Soviet Union or the United States. But you've got a 3-way war in Pakistan. Pakistani Arabs are fighting for land and independence. Jewish settlers are determined to defy the British restrictions. And you've got some British administrators with divided sympathies. They don't really know which way to go. So the United Nations partitioned the territory into 2 states in November of 1947. And there was a period of unrest and uncertainty until British finally got all of her people out a year later. Then Israel declared independence in May, right after the British left. Next day, President Truman and, I don't know what you would call Stalin, I guess you just call him the leader of the communist nation, recognized Israel as a new nation. And then Israel was immediately attacked by 5 neighboring Arabian states. Well, she wins this war. And all of a sudden, the Arabian-Israeli war extended the Israeli borders. And Palestine Arabians are in refugee camps in the Gaza Strip and West Bank. And of course, there's going to be 3 more wars, and there's continual shooting back and forth right now. It says from the 50s to the 70s, but actually it's into the 21st century. We still have problems over there. So let's move to a little bit more West African colonies. Britain left the people with a legal system in place, but no economic support, because after the war, she really didn't have any money to support anybody. And I can't even say that name. The karma driven from office for corruption in West Africa. Belgium and France also withdrew from their holdings. And when all these Westerners left, as much as they wanted them to leave, the people who were left could not do anything. They didn't have any really knowledge of how to run a country. They didn't have any tax brackets. They didn't have any, well, they didn't know how to do about their infrastructure. There's a rebellion in Kenya. And Kikuyu rose against the British in the settlements. And the British internment camps became sites of atrocities, which is not surprising. Most internment camps, no matter who's running them, do have atrocities. But there was independence for Kenya in 1963. In South Africa, Britain put up with the apartheid in South Africa because it was a kind of a political burden. As long as you don't become communist, you can be racist. They managed their labor and they banned any political protest there. It was bad. Rhodesia, Malawi exited the Federation in 64, and the people who were there declared independence in 65. But there was a bloody war between the people who were the settlers and the black Africans who wanted their own country back. It's kind of a delicate situation. It's hard when you have been living in one place for, 100, 150 years. You kind of consider it your own. You consider it your birthright. But the people who were there before your people came want it back. And we got a crisis in Suez. The nationalists forced British to withdraw troops from Egypt within 3 years, and King Farouk, who was a pro-British leader, was deposed, and a republic is proclaimed. The new leader of Egypt is Gamal Abdel Nasser. He nationalized the Suez Canal, totally removing the British control. And he wanted to finance the Aswar Dam, which is a point of pride with all Egyptians. But the Pan-Arabian alliance of Arabian states not beholden or controlled by the West. That sounds good. Well, Israel, France, and Great Britain did not like this. They didn't like the Arabs controlling the Suez Canal. They didn't like Egypt controlling the Suez Canal, so they attacked Egypt. Well, the United States became furious, and our new president, President Eisenhower, using financial threats, forced them to back out. You would think that Mr. Nasser, in charge of Egypt, would have been thankful, but no, it did not reciprocate toward the US of A. He instead moved closer and closer to the USSR. First Vietnam War. Oh, was there more than one? French Indochina. The French, of course, were there. One of France's last colonial areas. But the world wars had galvanized nationalist and communist independent movements all over in Ho Chi Minh. So in 1945, the British and Americans allowed the French to reclaim her Asian colonies, but the Vietnamese guerrillas said no, 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 no. And the French were pressed to fight on. Their last base at Dien Bien Phu fell in May of 1954 after begging the United States for aid, and President Eisenhower saying, no, we're not getting involved. Well, we might send you some people to give you advice, but we're not sending any troops. So in the Geneva Accords, when they were doing their peace treaty, Vietnam was partitioned with Ho Chi Minh in the north and a Western-supported government in the south. Elections were supposed to be held within a number of years between the north and south and reunite Vietnam. Of course, it's not going to happen. Meanwhile, back in Africa, the Algerian nationalists called on the Allies to recognize their independence, and there was public demonstrations. There was violence against the settlers, and the French in turn killed thousands of Arabs. But then they granted them limited enfranchisement, but that wasn't what they wanted. They wanted total freedom. So they formed the National Liberation Front. And then there was a civil war on 3 fronts. You had de Gaulle back in power in France. He declared that Algeria would always be French. But within 1 year, because of all the deaths and the violence, he kind of changed his mind. So Algeria declared her independence in 1962, and the settlers and the Berbers fled by the hundreds of thousands to get away from the retaliation. The war actually divided French society back in France because they thought the very identity of France was at stake. And what it meant to be a modern world power, you had to have colonies. Well, this is getting to be an old, outdated thought. Okay, we've talked just a little bit enough about politics and settlers and violence. Unless you are a literature major, or you're taking literature now, or you're interested in reading some of the classics, some of these names and book titles are going to be strange to you. And in all honesty, I ask very little about this particular section. This is a history class, yes, but the themes of post-war literature and war, the big issues are freedom, civilization, and the human condition. But the moral dilemmas of war, occupations, and resistance. And what about decolonization, issues of race and culture and colonization? Yes. Existentialism. John Paul Sartre and Albert Camus wrote about individuality and commitment and choice. That existence precedes essence. The meaning of life is not given, it is created. Campus wrote The Stranger, The Plague, and the Fall. No meaning in skin color. Race to derive meaning from experiences. Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex, which was used a lot in the women's movement of the United States. Marx and Freud, and the woman question. What about the black presence? There was a Presence Africaine formed in Paris. Aimé Césaire and Leopold Senghor, both men were exponents of what we call negritude, and I did say that right. It's black consciousness. It's also a theme of everything is black originated, such as Cleopatra was black. Napoleon had some black blood in him. I mean, it just put everything from a black perspective. The assimilation was a failure. It didn't go very far, except among a few radical black people. But there was powerful indictments of the colonialism, yeah. Franz Fenton said withdrawing into black culture was not an answer to racism, and he's right. You have to have a theory of a radical social change. And he points to the ironies of Europe's civilizing mission of, bringing up our little black brothers. A reevaluation of blackness as a central concept in Western culture. It was definitely needed. We had to stop thinking about the black race as being someone who needed help and recognize that they are human beings. They have a brain and they have rights the same as we do. There's individual helplessness in the face of state power. Of course, we all know George Orwell and the Animal Farm. Joseph Heller's Catch-22 was made into a movie. Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot. Harold Printer, The Caretaker in The Homecoming. And of course, then we've got hallucination and science fiction and fantasy, such as J.R.R. Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings. Didn't we just have a big television broadcast of that? And of course, the Frankfurt School of German Marxism. Theodor Adorah and Marx Horkheimer. Hannah Arendt was Jewish. She's a refugee from Germany, and she wrote about Nazism and Stalinism. And it should be understood as a form of totalitarianism, yes. And she wrote The Origin of Totalitarianism in 1951. Of course, then they're reaching a larger audience with books about the war and its aftermath. The Painted Bird, The Captive Mind, The Tin Drum, and of course, The Diary of Anne Frank. But in reality, repressing the past and overlooking it or trying not to think about it was really more common than trying to move forward. There were very few executions. What about all the war crimes that were committed on both sides? And there were very few trials. And you mythologize the resistance, and you avoid discussions of collaborations. Oh, there were so many beautiful stories that came out of France about the resistance. And even today, we're still finding people who collaborated with the Germans more than they should have. Jewish survivors found few editors even interested in publishing their stories because they were too horrible. Nobody wanted to read about the Jews. Yeah. After all, they killed Jesus, didn't they? What about the Cold War and the buried and distortion of memory? Much like in the United States, they have what they call the lost cause for the Civil War in the South. There was anti-communism and eagerness to embrace West Germany. Oh, yeah. Klaus Barbie was a Gestapo agent who had been recruited by the Americans, and we found out a lot of good stuff from him. But the Eastern Bloc regimes declared fascism a thing of the past. Yeah. A little bit closer to home, Fidel Castro led a successful revolution backed by the United States. And under Eisenhower, there was a plan come up with by the CIA to invade Cuba, called the Bay of Pigs. So when President Eisenhower was gone and President Kennedy came in, he was presented with his plan and was already put in motion before he had nothing really to do with it other than say, okay, go ahead. It was a disaster. All it did was push Cuba closer to Russia. And then there's a Cuban Missile Crisis. I think there was a movie called, 7 Days in September or something about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba. So President Kennedy orders a quarantine of Cuba and a naval blockade, and we had all of our Navy was surrounding Cuba with the gun ports unsheathed and ready to go. I mean, it was just that close. And as they said, Khrushchev blinked. Kennedy was not going to back down. He was a Cold War warrior. He would have definitely bombed Cuba had something not been done. And if he had bombed Cuba, what would have happened? The Soviet Russian would have bombed the United States. I mean, it's one of those domino type things that was going to happen if somebody didn't back down. So Khrushchev did back down and agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba on the condition that the United States remove missiles from Turkey. So the deal was struck. But there was worldwide fears of another Armageddon. And of course, Dr. Strangelove. That was the craziest movie I've ever seen in my life. And Bob Dylan's song, the Talking World War III Blues. The Cold War reaches into post-war culture and politics very much so. And President Eisenhower warned of the military-industrial complex taking over not only the United States but the world, which it did. Because when you're that, I guess you'd say, geared to staying militarily and every other way advanced and keeping this balance of power, we couldn't let Russia get ahead of us. I think we just outspent Russia is what happened. Western European integration and cooperation, a little bit better. Eastern European restrictions, clamping down. Europe's under control by two non-European forces, the United States of America and the United Socialist Soviet Republic. And it led European states to look for ways to express their own identity because you've got these big brothers on either side of you. There's a loss of the colonies and groundwork for a more integrated Europe, and a consensus in the West about the new role of the state in society. What are we going to do? And I wish we had the time to go into it a little bit more, but I think everyone, you've heard it said before, most of us professors do not like these 7-week courses. It's pushing too much information at you in too short a time, I believe. We don't have time to go into the nuances of what's going on. That being said, don't forget to do your little quiz that the school wants you to do called like critical analysis. It's over information that we have covered. And like I say, it's not mandatory. You don't have to do it, but it will cost you 35 points on your final score if you don't. Thank you for attending the course. I wish you a safe, happy Christmas and an even safer, happier New Year.